Marcus Rodriguez had been awake since 0430 hours, just like every other morning for the past 15 years. Old habits from his Navy SEAL days died hard, even though he'd been retired from active duty for 3 years now. The discipline that had kept him alive through countless missions in Afghanistan and Iraq still governed his daily routine. By 0500, he was already dressed in his running gear, stepping out into the cool morning air of Riverside, California. The suburban neighborhood was quiet at this hour, with only the occasional dog walker or fellow early riser breaking the peaceful silence. Marcus preferred it this way. The solitude reminded him of those pre-dawn moments before a mission, when the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. He'd traded his tactical gear for civilian clothes, but the alertness never left him. His eyes still swept the environment automatically, noting every detail, every potential threat or anomaly. As he rounded the corner onto Maple Street, something caught his attention. There, huddled on a bench at the small neighborhood park, was a woman. She appeared to be in her 30s, thin to the point of frailness, wearing clothes that had seen better days. Her dark hair hung in limp strands around her face, and, even from a distance, Marcus could see she was shivering in the morning chill. His first instinct was tactical assessment. Was she a threat? Injured? In need of assistance? Years of training had taught him to evaluate situations quickly and thoroughly. As he jogged closer, maintaining a non-threatening pace, he observed more details. No visible weapons, no signs of aggression, but definite signs of distress and what appeared to be homelessness. The woman looked up as he approached, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resignation. Marcus could see she was probably attractive when healthy, but exhaustion and hardship had carved deep lines around her eyes. There was something in her expression that reminded him of the civilians he'd encountered in war zones, people who had endured more than anyone should have to bear. Marcus slowed to a walk, then stopped a respectful distance away. In his military service, he learned that approaching vulnerable people required careful consideration. Too close, too fast, and you could trigger a fight or flight response. Too distant or indifferent, and you missed opportunities to help those who truly needed it. "Morning," he said simply, his voice calm and non-threatening. Years of leading men in high-stress situations had taught him the power of a steady, confident tone. The woman tensed, but didn't flee. "Morning," she replied quietly, her voice hoarse as if she hadn't spoken in a while. Marcus noted the worn backpack beside her, the way she clutched a thin jacket around herself, the fact that she appeared to have slept on the bench. Everything about her situation screamed homelessness, but there was something else. Unlike many of the homeless individuals he'd encountered, she didn't appear to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Her eyes, though tired, were clear and intelligent. "I'm Marcus," he offered, making a decision that would change both their lives. "I live in the neighborhood. I run this route every morning." She hesitated before responding. "Sarah," she said finally, as if even sharing her name was a risk. Marcus nodded, filing away the information. Sarah, mid-30s, homeless but lucid, alone and vulnerable. In the military, he learned to gather intelligence quickly and make decisions based on incomplete information. Every instinct told him this woman needed help, but he also knew that approaching someone in her situation required delicacy. "It's cold this morning," he observed, stating the obvious but keeping the conversation neutral. The weather report said it might drop into the 40s tonight. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter. "I'll manage," she said, but Marcus caught the slight tremor in her voice that had nothing to do with the cold. He glanced around the small park, noting the lack of shelter, the open exposure to elements, and potential dangers. As a SEAL, he'd survived in harsh environments, but he'd had training, equipment, and team support. This woman had none of those advantages. "There's a diner about 6 blocks from here," Marcus said casually. "They serve breakfast starting at 6. Good coffee, warm inside." Sarah's eyes flickered with what might have been interest before wariness took over. "I appreciate the suggestion," she said carefully. Marcus recognized the polite deflection. Pride, he realized, She had pride, which meant she hadn't been on the streets long enough to have it completely worn away. That was both encouraging and concerning. Encouraging because it meant she might be more receptive to help. Concerning because pride could prevent someone from accepting assistance they desperately needed. He made another quick decision. I usually grab coffee there after my run, he said, which wasn't entirely true, but wasn't entirely false either. If you change your mind, it's called Mel's Place, on Harbor Boulevard. Without waiting for a response, Marcus resumed his run, but his mind remained focused on Sarah. As he continued his route, he found himself analyzing the situation with the same methodical approach he'd once applied to military operations. Sarah was in immediate danger, not from enemy combatants, but from exposure, hunger, and the countless risks that came with life on the streets. She appeared to be trying to maintain some semblance of dignity and normalcy, which suggested she hadn't been homeless for very long. Marcus completed his 5-mile loop and headed home, but he couldn't shake the image of Sarah huddled on that bench. His house, a modest ranch-style home he'd purchased after retiring, felt almost offensively warm and comfortable in comparison to her situation. He showered, made breakfast, and tried to focus on his morning routine, but his thoughts kept returning to the park. By 0800, he was in his pickup truck driving back toward Maple Street. He told himself he was just checking, making sure she was safe, but deep down he knew he was already committed to helping her somehow. As he'd learned in the military, once you identified a problem, you developed and executed a solution. Sarah was still on the bench, looking smaller and more vulnerable in the growing daylight. Marcus parked across the street and observed for a few minutes, noting that several people had passed by without acknowledgement. She was becoming invisible the way homeless people often did in society. He approached again, this time carrying a cup of coffee and a breakfast sandwich from a nearby convenience store. "I thought you might be hungry," he said simply, holding out the food. Sarah looked up at him with surprise and suspicion. "Why?" she asked. It was a fair question. Marcus considered his answer carefully. In the SEALs, they had a saying, "The only easy day was yesterday." It meant that challenges were constant, but also that you face them head on. He decided on honesty. "Because I've been in situations where someone's kindness made the difference between a bad day and a catastrophic one," he said. "And because it's the right thing to do." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine his true motivations. Marcus stood patiently, understanding that trust was earned, not demanded. Finally, she reached out and accepted the coffee. "Thank you," she said quietly. Marcus sat on the opposite end of the bench, maintaining distance but showing he wasn't rushing away. "How long have you been staying out here?" Sarah took a sip of coffee before answering. 3 weeks, she admitted. Maybe 4. The days sort of blur together. 3 to 4 weeks. Recent enough that she might have family, friends, resources to fall back on if the right opportunities presented themselves. Marcus filed this information away. "What happened?" he asked gently. Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Life happened. Bad decisions, worse luck, and a complete collapse of everything I thought I could count on." She took another sip of coffee. "I had a job, an apartment, a normal life. Then I got sick, couldn't work, lost the job, couldn't pay rent, got evicted. And here we are." The story was unfortunately common. Marcus knew. One medical emergency, one job loss, one unexpected expense could push someone from stability into homelessness faster than most people realized. He'd seen it happen to fellow veterans who struggled with the transition to civilian life, though he'd been fortunate enough to have savings and disability benefits that provided a safety net. "What kind of work did you do?" he asked. "Administrative assistant at a law firm," Sarah replied. "Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. At least it did until I ended up in the hospital for a week, and they decided I was unreliable." Marcus felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced when witnessing injustice during his military service. He'd spent years fighting for American ideals of freedom and opportunity, only to return home and discover how easily those ideals failed the most vulnerable citizens. "Have you been able to apply for assistance?" Unemployment, social services, anything like that. Sarah shook her head. I tried. The bureaucracy is overwhelming when you don't have a permanent address, a phone, or internet access. And the waiting lists for everything are months long. She gestured to her backpack. I lost most of my important documents when I got evicted. Trying to replace them without ID or an address is nearly impossible. Marcus nodded, understanding the catch. 22 situation many homeless individuals faced. You needed an address to get services, but you needed services to get housing. You needed ID to get benefits, but you needed benefits to afford the fees for replacing lost ID. The system seemed designed to keep people trapped rather than help them escape their circumstances. What about family? Friends, he asked. Sarah's expression darkened. My parents died in a car accident 5 years ago. I was an only child. As for friends, she shrugged. Funny how quickly people disappear when you can't maintain the lifestyle they're used to. When you can't meet them for dinner or drinks or weekend trips because you're trying to scrape together rent money. Marcus recognized the isolation that often accompanied financial hardship. Pride prevented people from asking for help until it was too late, and by then, many relationships had already been strained beyond repair. He'd been fortunate to have military brothers who understood the concept of never leaving anyone behind, but civilians often lack those kinds of unbreakable bonds. Listen, he said, making another decision that his SEAL training had taught him to make quickly and decisively. I'm going to be running this route every morning at the same time. If you're still here, I'll bring coffee and something to eat. No strings attached, no expectations. Just because everyone deserves to start their day with something warm. Sarah stared at him for a long moment. Why would you do that? Marcus thought about the question seriously. Why was he willing to commit to helping a stranger? Part of it was his military background, the ingrained belief that you help those who couldn't help themselves. Part of it was his own experience with hardship, though his had been different from hers. And part of it was simply recognizing a fellow human being in need. Because I can, he said finally, and because in my experience, small acts of kindness can sometimes lead to bigger changes. Over the following days, Marcus established a routine. Every morning after his run, he would find Sarah on the bench and bring her coffee and food. They developed a cautious friendship built on consistency and respect. Marcus never pressured her to share more than she was comfortable with, and Sarah gradually began to trust that his help came without hidden agendas. Through their conversations, Marcus learned more about Sarah's situation. She'd been working at Henderson, Martinez, Cooper & Associates, a mid-sized law firm in downtown Riverside, for 3 years before her health crisis. She'd been good at her job, well-liked by most of the attorneys, and had been hoping for a promotion before everything fell apart. Her illness had been pneumonia that developed complications, keeping her hospitalized for a week and requiring several weeks of recovery time. Despite having medical documentation, her employer had used her absence as grounds for termination, claiming she'd violated their attendance policy. Without income, she'd burned through her small savings trying to maintain her apartment, but it hadn't been enough. Marcus found Sarah's story both heartbreaking and infuriating. She was clearly intelligent, capable, and motivated to work. Her situation was temporary and solvable with the right intervention. The problem was that solving it required navigating systems that seemed designed to prevent rather than provide solutions. As the days passed, Marcus noticed changes in Sarah. The regular meals and hot coffee were helping her regain some physical strength. More importantly, having someone to talk to each morning was restoring her sense of human connection and dignity. She began to smile occasionally, and Marcus caught glimpses of the person she had been before circumstances broke her down. 2 weeks into their routine, Sarah asked the question Marcus had been expecting. Why haven't you asked me to move along? To go to a shelter or find somewhere else to sleep? Marcus had been wondering when she'd bring this up. The truth was he had considered suggesting alternatives, but his research into local resources had been discouraging. The homeless shelters in the area were overcrowded, underfunded, and often more dangerous than the streets. The waiting lists for transitional housing were months long. Social services were overwhelmed and understaffed. Because this seems to be working for now, he said honestly. You're safe here, and I'd rather know where you are than have you disappear into a system that might not actually help you. Sarah nodded slowly. I've been thinking about what comes next, she admitted. I can't stay on this bench forever, but I also don't know how to break out of this cycle. Every job application asks for an address and phone number I don't have. Every apartment wants credit checks and deposits I can't provide. Marcus had been thinking about this problem too. His SEAL training had taught him to approach complex problems systematically, breaking them down into manageable components. Sarah's situation had several key obstacles: lack of permanent address, lack of communication access, lack of interview-appropriate clothing, and lack of financial resources for deposits and fees. What if we worked on one problem at a time, he suggested. Start with the basics and build from there. Sarah looked interested but cautious. What do you mean? Marcus had been formulating a plan for several days. I mean, what if I could help you get a phone number, an address you could use for applications, and maybe some professional clothes for interviews? Would that give you a better chance of getting back on your feet? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You've already done so much. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. Marcus interrupted gently. I'm offering, and I have my reasons. Those reasons were complex and personal. Marcus had struggled with his own transition from military to civilian life, though his challenges had been different from Sarah's. He'd seen too many fellow veterans fall through the cracks because they were too proud to ask for help or because the systems meant to support them were inadequate. Helping Sarah felt like a way to honor those who hadn't been as fortunate as he had been. More than that, Marcus recognized something in Sarah that reminded him of his younger sister, Maria. Maria had died in a car accident 10 years earlier, but she'd had the same intelligence, the same determination to maintain dignity in difficult circumstances, the same basic decency that Marcus saw in Sarah. Helping Sarah wouldn't bring Maria back, but it felt like honoring her memory. That evening, Marcus sat at his home office and developed what he mentally called Operation Second Chance. Using skills he'd learned in military planning, he identified resources, potential obstacles, and step-by-step objectives. He researched local services, employment opportunities, and housing options. He made lists of what Sarah would need and how he might be able to help her obtain those things. The plan was ambitious but achievable. First, practical necessities: a cell phone, appropriate clothing, and access to shower facilities for interviews. Second, administrative support: help with paperwork, job applications, and navigating bureaucratic requirements. Third, temporary housing solutions while she saved money for permanent accommodations. Marcus knew he was taking on a significant commitment, but it felt right in a way that few things had since his retirement from the military. For the first time in months, he felt like he was engaged in a mission that mattered. The next morning, he approached Sarah with renewed purpose. As he handed her the usual coffee and breakfast sandwich, he also pulled out a notebook. I've been thinking about your situation, he said, and I have some ideas. But first, I need to know if you're serious about wanting to get back to work and off the streets. Sarah straightened, and Marcus saw a flash of the competent professional she had once been. Absolutely, she said without hesitation. I'll do whatever it takes. Marcus opened the notebook. Then, let's make a plan. As they talked through his ideas, Marcus watched Sarah's posture change. Her shoulders squared, her voice became stronger, and her eyes showed the first real hope he'd seen since meeting her. She asked intelligent questions, offered practical suggestions, and demonstrated the kind of problem-solving ability that Marcus knew would serve her well in getting back on her feet. By the end of their conversation, they had established goals and timelines. Marcus would help Sarah obtain a prepaid phone and establish a mail forwarding address. They would work together on updating her resume and practicing interview skills. He would provide transportation to job interviews and help her navigate the process of replacing lost identification documents. It was an extensive commitment, but Marcus felt energized rather than burdened. This was the kind of clear mission with defined objectives that he understood. Success would be measured by Sarah's return to stable employment and housing. Failure was not an option. As Marcus prepared to leave for the rest of his day, Sarah called out to him. "Marcus," she said, "I don't understand why you're doing this, but I want you to know that it means everything to me. You've given me something I was starting to lose." "What's that?" Marcus asked. "Hope," Sarah replied simply. Marcus nodded, understanding the power of that word. In his military experience, hope was often the difference between survival and surrender, between completing a mission and giving up. If he could give Sarah hope, everything else would follow. As he drove home, Marcus felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since leaving the military. He was embarking on a new kind of mission, one that wouldn't involve weapons or combat, but would require the same dedication, strategic thinking, and refusal to quit that had made him an effective SEAL. He had no way of knowing that within a matter of weeks, lawyers would arrive and turn his carefully planned operation into something far more complex and dangerous than anything he'd faced in military service. But for now, he was simply a retired SEAL who had found someone worth fighting for, and that was enough. Operation Second Chance was proceeding ahead of schedule. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus began his systematic approach to helping Sarah rebuild her life, and the results exceeded even his optimistic projections. Sarah now had a prepaid smartphone, a post office box for mail, and 3 professional outfits that Marcus had helped her select from a discount store. More importantly, she had regained the confidence that homelessness had slowly eroded. Marcus had established a temporary base of operations at the local library, where Sarah could use computers for job searches and applications. He'd also arranged for her to have access to shower facilities at a community center where he volunteered, teaching self-defense classes to women. The arrangement satisfied his need for operational security. He wanted to help Sarah without exposing either of them to unnecessary risks or complications. The transformation in Sarah was remarkable. The frightened, defeated woman Marcus had first encountered on the park bench was evolving back into the competent professional she had once been. Her posture had straightened, her voice had regained its strength, and her eyes showed the sharp intelligence that had once made her valuable to Henderson, Martinez, Cooper, and Associates. "I have 2 interviews this week," Sarah announced during their morning coffee meeting, her excitement barely contained. "One at a medical office and another at an accounting firm. Both are looking for administrative assistants with experience in legal documentation." Marcus felt the satisfaction he'd once experienced when a military operation achieved its objectives. "That's excellent news. Have you prepared answers for the standard questions about your employment gap?" Sarah nodded confidently. "I've been practicing the explanation we developed. Medical leave followed by a period of family care responsibilities. It wasn't entirely false. She had needed medical care, and caring for herself during homelessness had been a full-time responsibility. I feel ready." Marcus studied her carefully, noting the professional appearance they'd worked so hard to achieve. Sarah's hair was clean and styled, her clothes were appropriate and well-fitted, and she carried herself with the poise of someone who belonged in an office environment. To anyone meeting her for the first time, there would be no indication of the hardships she'd endured. "Transportation arrangements?" Marcus asked, running through his mental checklist. "You're picking me up at the library at 9:15 for the medical office interview, and I can take the bus to the accounting firm interview on Thursday," Sarah replied. "I've already scouted both routes." Marcus appreciated her attention to detail. Sarah approached job hunting with the same methodical preparation he'd once applied to military missions. She researched companies thoroughly, prepared specific questions about each position, and had developed what she called her professional arsenal, examples and anecdotes that demonstrated her skills and experience. Their morning routine had evolved beyond simple charity. Marcus found himself genuinely enjoying their conversations, and he respected the way Sarah had embraced their partnership without becoming dependent on it. She understood that his help was temporary assistance, not permanent support, and she was working diligently to regain her independence. There's something else, Sarah said, her tone shifting to something more serious. I've been thinking about what happened to my old job, the way they fire me after my illness. Marcus had been wondering when she would bring this up. During their conversations, he noted several details about Sarah's termination that raised red flags. Her employer's handling of her medical leave seemed questionable at best, potentially illegal at worst. What specifically has been bothering you about it? Marcus asked. Sarah pulled out a small notebook where she'd been recording her thoughts. I've been writing down everything I remember about the sequence of events. The timelines, the conversations, the written communications I received. And I'm starting to think they didn't follow their own policies, let alone legal requirements. Marcus leaned forward, interested. His experience with military regulations had taught him to recognize when procedures weren't being followed properly. Give me the details. Sarah consulted her notes. I was hospitalized on a Thursday. I called in that morning and spoke directly to my supervisor, Jennifer Chun. She told me not to worry about anything except getting better. I was in the hospital for 6 days, and Jennifer visited me twice. She never mentioned any paperwork I needed to file or any policies I might be violating. What happened when you were released? My doctor said I needed another week of recovery at home before returning to work. I called Jennifer and explained the situation. She said it was fine and that they would handle everything with HR. I even offered to work from home if they needed me to, but she said rest was more important. Marcus was already seeing problems with this sequence. Did you receive anything in writing about your leave status? That's just it, no. Everything was verbal. When I called to confirm my return date, Jennifer seemed different. Cold. She said I needed to speak with HR and transferred me to Patricia Vance. And what did HR tell you? Sarah's expression darkened. Patricia said I had violated the company's attendance policy by missing more than 5 consecutive days without proper authorization. She claimed I had never filed the correct medical leave paperwork and that my absence was considered job abandonment. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Even without legal expertise, this sounded like a clear violation of employment law. Did you explain about the conversations with Jennifer? I tried, but Patricia said Jennifer had no authority to approve extended leave and that I should have known to contact HR directly. She said the decision to terminate me was final. Sarah's voice carried the pain of betrayal. Jennifer wouldn't even take my calls after that. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing the information. In the military, failure to follow proper procedures could have life or death consequences, so he developed a keen appreciation for the importance of documentation and due process. Sarah's situation reeked of scapegoating and possibly discrimination. Have you considered consulting with an employment attorney? Marcus asked. Sarah laughed bitterly. With what money? And besides, who's going to believe a homeless woman against a prestigious law firm? I figured I just needed to move on. Marcus understood her logic, but it troubled him. Injustice was injustice, regardless of the victim's current circumstances. More importantly, if Sarah had legitimate legal claims against her former employer, pursuing them might provide both financial compensation and emotional closure. What if I told you there might be ways to get legal consultation without upfront costs? Marcus asked. Sarah looked skeptical. I'd say you're being optimistic. Marcus smiled. I'd say I've learned to research thoroughly before making suggestions. He'd actually spent considerable time investigating legal aid options in the area, partly out of curiosity about Sarah's situation, and partly because he'd encountered other veterans who needed legal assistance but couldn't afford it. Over the following days, Marcus helped Sarah document her case more thoroughly. They created a timeline of events, gathered what documentation she still possessed, and identified potential witnesses who might corroborate her story. Sarah remembered that one of the paralegals, a woman named Lisa Rodriguez, had expressed surprise about her termination and mentioned that the firm's handling of the situation seemed weird. Marcus approached the legal research with military precision. He studied California employment law, familiarized himself with Family Medical Leave Act requirements, and researched Henderson, Martinez, Cooper, and Associates to better understand their practices and reputation. What he discovered was intriguing. The law firm specialized in corporate defense, particularly employment law cases. They represented companies accused of wrongful termination, discrimination, and violation of worker rights. The irony of Sarah being illegally fired by lawyers who made their living defending against illegal firing claims was not lost on Marcus. More interesting was what Marcus found in public records and legal databases. Henderson, Martinez, Cooper, and Associates have been named in several employment disputes over the past 3 years. While most cases have been settled confidentially, the pattern suggested a firm that wasn't always as careful about following employment law as their business model would suggest. I found something, Marcus told Sarah during their morning meeting a week later. There's a legal aid clinic associated with UC Riverside that provides free consultations for employment law cases. They have a specific program for people who've been wrongfully terminated. Sarah's interest was clearly piqued, but she remained cautious. What would be the point? Even if I had a case, it would take years to resolve, and I need income now. Marcus had considered this objection. The point would be justice and potentially significant financial compensation. Sarah met with Professor Elena Martinez, a specialist in employment law who had been practicing for over 20 years before joining the law school faculty. Marcus waited in the reception area, using the time to observe the other clients and staff. He was impressed by the professionalism and obvious dedication of the people working there. After 90 minutes, Sarah emerged from the consultation looking stunned. Professor Martinez accompanied her, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. Mr. Rodriguez? Professor Martinez addressed Marcus. Sarah has told me about the support you've been providing. I want you to know that what you've done is remarkable. Marcus was pleased by the acknowledgement, but more interested in the legal assessment. What's your opinion of Sarah's case? Professor Martinez glanced at Sarah, who nodded permission to speak freely. Based on what Sarah has told me and the documentation she's provided, I believe she has an extremely strong case for wrongful termination. The company's handling of her medical leave appears to have violated both federal and state law. Marcus felt a familiar rush of satisfaction, the feeling of accurate intelligence assessment being confirmed. What's the next step? I'm going to refer Sarah to a colleague of mine who specializes in employment litigation. James Chun is one of the best employment attorneys in the state, and he's particularly effective against large law firms who think they can bully individual employees. Sarah looked overwhelmed, but I still don't understand how this helps me right now. I need a job, not a lawsuit. Professor Martinez smiled sympathetically. Sarah, if your case is as strong as I believe it is, the mere threat of litigation might be enough to achieve a settlement that includes significant compensation. Many companies prefer to settle quickly rather than face the publicity and expense of a trial. Marcus was intrigued by the strategic implications. How quickly could something like that happen? With a case this straightforward, James could probably have a demand letter prepared within 2 weeks. If the company is smart, they'll want to negotiate immediately. As they drove back from the clinic, Sarah was uncharacteristically quiet. Marcus gave her space to process the information, understanding that the possibility of vindication and compensation was probably overwhelming after weeks of believing she had no recourse. I keep thinking this is too good to be true, Sarah finally said, that somehow this will backfire and make everything worse. Marcus understood her caution. Hope was dangerous when you've been disappointed repeatedly. What's your worst-case scenario? He asked. Sarah considered the question. They fight it, drag it out for years, and I end up with nothing but legal bills and a reputation as a troublemaker who sues employers. And your best-case scenario? They settle quickly for enough money to get back on my feet and maybe have something left over for the future. Marcus nodded. Both scenarios are possible. But consider this, right now, you have nothing to lose. You're homeless, unemployed, and already dealing with the consequences of their actions. Taking legal action doesn't make your situation worse, and it might make it significantly better. Sarah smiled for the first time that day. When you put it like that, it seems like an easy decision. Most good decisions are easy once you have all the information, Marcus replied. The hard part is gathering that information and having the courage to act on it. 3 days later, Sarah met with James Chun at his downtown office. Marcus offered to drive her, but she insisted on taking public transportation, wanting to demonstrate to herself that she could handle professional meetings independently. Marcus respected her decision while making sure she had his phone number in case she needed backup. James Chun turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his early 40s who had built a reputation as one of California's most effective employment attorneys. His office was modest but professional, filled with law books and certificates from successful cases. What impressed Marcus most when he met Chun briefly was the attorney's obvious respect for Sarah as a client rather than as a charity case. "Your case is even stronger than Professor Martinez indicated," Chun told Sarah during their meeting. "I've seen the employment manual for Henderson, Martinez, Cooper and Associates, and they violated their own policies multiple times in handling your situation." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and anger. So they knew they were acting improperly? Almost certainly. The question is whether they acted out of ignorance, negligence, or deliberate malice. For our purposes, it doesn't matter. The law was violated regardless of their intent. Chun explained his strategy in terms that reminded Marcus of military planning. They would begin with a detailed demand letter outlining the violations and requesting compensation. The letter would include copies of all relevant documentation and a clear timeline of events. If the company failed to respond appropriately, they would file a lawsuit in federal court. "What kind of compensation are we talking about?" Sarah asked. "Based on similar cases and the specific violations involved, I would expect a settlement in a range of $50,000 to $100,000, Chun replied. "Possibly more if we can demonstrate that their actions caused additional damages beyond lost wages." Sarah's eyes widened. That amount of money would not only solve her immediate problems, but provide a foundation for rebuilding her life more securely than before. "There's one more thing," Chun added. "I did some research on your former employer. They've had several similar cases in recent years, all settled confidentially. I suspect they have a pattern of treating medical leave requests improperly, particularly for lower-level employees." Marcus leaned forward, interested. "What does that mean for Sarah's case?" "It means they have strong incentive to settle quickly and quietly rather than risk a public trial that might encourage other former employees to come forward with similar claims." As they prepared to leave Chun's office, Sarah signed a retainer agreement that committed the attorney to work on contingency. If they won or settled, Chun would receive 1/3 of the compensation plus expenses. If they lost, Sarah owed nothing. "How long before we know something?" Sarah asked. "I'll have the demand letter prepared and delivered by the end of next week," Chun replied. "Companies typically have 30 days to respond, but in my experience, cases like this resolve much faster. I expect to hear from them within a week of receiving our letter." Marcus felt the familiar anticipation that came with waiting for mission results. Everything they could do to prepare had been done. Now, it was a matter of executing the plan and waiting for the enemy to respond. As they left the attorney's office, Marcus noticed that Sarah's entire demeanor had changed. She walked taller, spoke more confidently, and seemed to radiate the quiet strength that comes from knowing you're not facing your challenges alone. "I want to thank you," Sarah said as they reached the street. "Not just for the help with basic needs, but for pushing me to pursue this. I would never have had the courage to challenge them on my own." Marcus smiled. "You would have found the courage eventually. I just helped you find it a little sooner. What happens now?" "Now we wait for them to make their move," Marcus replied. "And we continue with the job search in case they decide to fight rather than settle." Sarah nodded, understanding the wisdom of maintaining multiple strategies. "Either way, I feel like I have my power back." Marcus knew exactly what she meant. In the military, the worst situations were those where you felt helpless, unable to influence the outcome of events affecting your life. Taking action, even uncertain action, was almost always better than passive acceptance of bad circumstances. Neither of them could have predicted that within days, their careful legal strategy would be complicated by the arrival of 4 lawyers who would transform Sarah's employment dispute into something far more complex and dangerous than either of them had anticipated. For now, though, Marcus was satisfied with the progress of Operation Second Chance. Sarah had regained her confidence, assembled a strong legal case, and positioned herself to reclaim control of her future. Whatever happened next, she would face it as a fighter rather than a victim. As Marcus drove home that evening, he reflected on how much his life had changed since meeting Sarah on that park bench. Helping her had given him a sense of purpose and mission that he'd missed since leaving the military. More than that, it had reminded him of the fundamental truth that had guided his military service, that the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies, but from protecting and empowering those who couldn't protect themselves. The real test of Operation Second Chance was still to come, but Marcus felt confident they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. He had no way of knowing that those challenges would test not only their legal strategy, but also everything he'd learned about courage, loyalty, and fighting for what was right. The demand letter was delivered to Henderson, Martinez, Cooper and Associates on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, four lawyers had arrived at the small park where Marcus and Sarah conducted their morning meetings. They didn't announce themselves or approach directly. They simply appeared, like predators circling prey, watching and documenting everything. Marcus noticed them first. His SEAL training had made him acutely aware of surveillance, and the four well-dressed individuals trying to look casual while clearly conducting observation triggered every alarm in his head. They were too clean, too coordinated, and too interested in the park bench where Sarah spent her days to be innocent bystanders. "We have company," Marcus told Sarah quietly during their Friday morning coffee meeting, nodding toward the quartet positioned at strategic points around the small park. Sarah followed his gaze and tensed immediately. "Lawyers?" Almost certainly, Marcus confirmed, studying their positions and behavior patterns. "Professional surveillance, multiple angles, expensive clothes. Your former employer is taking your case seriously." Sarah's face paled. "This feels like intimidation." Marcus understood her concern, but his military experience suggested a different interpretation. "Actually, this might be good news. If they're spending money on surveillance, it means they're scared. Scared people make mistakes, and they also settle cases quickly." The lawyers maintained their observation for 3 hours, during which Marcus and Sarah conducted themselves normally while he mentally cataloged everything about their surveillance team. 2 men, 2 women, all appearing to be in their 30s or 40s. Professional, but not law enforcement, their positioning was too obvious for real surveillance work. They were clearly trying to intimidate rather than gather intelligence. "The tall woman in the blue suit keeps photographing us with her phone," Sarah observed. Marcus had noticed that too. "Let her. We're in a public place doing nothing illegal or inappropriate. If anything, documenting their harassment will strengthen your case." As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself analyzing the situation with increasing interest. The speed and intensity of Henderson, Martinez, Cooper and Associates' response suggested Sarah's case was even stronger than they'd realized. Law firms didn't deploy multiple attorneys to observe homeless women unless they were facing serious legal exposure. "I need to call James Chun," Sarah said as the surveillance team finally departed around noon. "Agreed," Marcus replied. "And I think we need to document everything that just happened." Chen's response to their report was immediate and decisive. "This is completely inappropriate behavior," he told them during an emergency conference call. "Attorney surveillance of opposing parties is unethical and possibly illegal, especially when it's clearly intended to intimidate." "What do we do about it?" Sarah asked. "We document everything and use it against them," Chen replied with obvious satisfaction. "This kind of behavior suggests desperation, and desperate opponents make poor decisions. I'm going to accelerate our timeline and demand an immediate response to our settlement offer." Marcus was impressed by Chen's strategic thinking. The attorney understood that Henderson, Martinez, Cooper and Associates had just provided additional ammunition for Sarah's case by acting unprofessionally. "What should we expect next?" Marcus asked. "They'll probably try more direct intimidation tactics," Chen warned. Threatening phone calls, letters from different attorneys, maybe even attempts to contact you directly. Don't respond to any communication that doesn't come through me. Over the weekend, Chen's prediction proved accurate. Sarah's prepaid phone received 7 calls from unknown numbers, none of which left voicemails. She also received a certified letter at her post office box from a different law firm, which Chen instructed her to forward unopened. Marcus found the escalating pressure tactics both revealing and concerning. On one hand, the aggressive response confirmed that Sarah's case was strong enough to frighten her former employer. On the other hand, their willingness to engage in questionable tactics suggested they might be prepared to fight dirty rather than settle fairly. "I'm starting to feel like I'm in over my head," Sarah admitted during their Monday morning meeting. "These people have resources and experience I can't match." Marcus understood her anxiety, but he also recognized an opportunity to share one of the most important lessons from his military training. "Sarah, you're not fighting alone anymore. You have an excellent attorney, you have legal precedent on your side, and you have the truth. Those are powerful weapons. But they have money and connections, and they have guilty consciences," Marcus interrupted. "Innocent parties don't behave the way they're behaving. Every intimidation tactic they use just proves you're right, and they know it." Marcus was pleased to see Sarah straighten her shoulders at his words. One of the most important skills a SEAL learned was maintaining confidence and fighting spirit even when facing superior forces. Sarah was learning that same skill. On Tuesday morning, the surveillance team returned, but this time they were more aggressive. Instead of maintaining distance, they approached Sarah directly while Marcus was getting coffee from a nearby vendor. "Ms. Thompson," the tall woman in the blue suit addressed Sarah with false friendliness. "I'm Rebecca Martinez from Martinez and Associates. We represent Henderson, Martinez, Cooper and Associates in employment matters." Sarah remembered James Chen's instructions and remained silent, but she felt her heart racing as the 4 lawyers surrounded her bench. "We understand you've been spreading false allegations about your former employer," another attorney said, a middle-aged man with graying hair. "We want to give you the opportunity to resolve this misunderstanding before it becomes a serious problem for you." Marcus returned at that moment, immediately assessing the tactical situation. For opponents, one friendly, vulnerable positioning. His SEAL training kicked in automatically as he approached the group. "Gentlemen, ladies," Marcus said calmly, positioning himself between Sarah and the attorneys. "Beautiful morning for a walk in the park." Rebecca Martinez tried to maintain her false friendliness. "Are you Ms. Thompson's attorney?" "I'm her friend," Marcus replied simply. "And you are?" The graying attorney stepped forward, clearly trying to establish dominance through physical presence. Marcus noticed the attempt and smiled slightly. Intimidation tactics that might work on civilians were laughably ineffective against someone who'd faced actual enemies in life-or-death situations. "We're attorneys representing Henderson, Martinez, Cooper and Associates," the man said. "We're trying to resolve a misunderstanding with Ms. Thompson." Marcus kept his voice calm and friendly. "I'm sure her attorney will be happy to discuss any concerns you have. James Chun, downtown office. I'm sure you can find his number." "This doesn't concern you, sir," Rebecca Martinez interjected with less friendliness. "This is a private matter between our clients and Ms. Thompson." Marcus felt his protective instincts fully engage. These people were trying to intimidate someone under his protection, and that was unacceptable regardless of their professional credentials. "Actually," Marcus said, still maintaining his calm tone, "since you approached Ms. Thompson in a public place where she was minding her own business, it became everyone's concern, especially mine." The 4th attorney, a younger woman who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Are you threatening us?" Marcus smiled genuinely. "Ma'am, if I were threatening you, you'd know it. I'm simply suggesting that any business you have with Ms. Thompson should be conducted through proper legal channels." The graying attorney tried one more intimidation tactic. "Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez, you should be aware that interfering with legal proceedings can have serious consequences." Marcus's smile didn't waver. "So can harassing homeless women in public parks. But I'm sure that's not what you're doing here. The legal team exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that their intimidation approach wasn't working. Rebecca Martinez tried a different strategy. Ms. Thompson, she addressed Sarah directly, we're prepared to offer you $5,000 to resolve this matter quickly and quietly. All you need to do is sign a simple agreement acknowledging that your termination was appropriate and that you have no further claims against our client. Sarah looked at Marcus, who gave her an almost imperceptible shake of his head. She remembered Chin's advice about not responding to direct contact. I appreciate the offer, Sarah said finally, but my attorney handles all legal matters for me. $5,000 is a generous offer for someone in your circumstances, the younger attorney said with barely concealed condescension. It would be unfortunate if you let pride prevent you from accepting reasonable compensation. Marcus felt his anger spike at the attorney's tone, but he kept his expression neutral. These people were confirming everything negative he'd ever heard about lawyers. They were arrogant, condescending, and willing to exploit vulnerable people. I think this conversation is over, Marcus said firmly. Ms. Thompson has told you to contact her attorney. Continuing to pressure her after that response constitutes harassment. The graying attorney's facade of politeness finally cracked. And what exactly are you going to do about it? Marcus stepped closer, close enough that only the attorney could hear his response. Sir, I spent 15 years in the Navy SEALs learning very creative ways to solve problems. I'm hoping we can resolve this situation without me needing to be creative. The attorney stepped back, finally, recognizing that he was dealing with someone who wasn't intimidated by legal threats. The quartet conferred briefly in whispers before Rebecca Martinez addressed Sarah one final time. Our offer stands until tomorrow at 5 p.m., she said. After that, we'll be forced to pursue other options. As the attorneys departed, Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction of a successful defensive action. The enemy had probed their defenses, failed to achieve their objectives, and retreated. More importantly, they'd revealed valuable intelligence about their strategy and desperation level. That was terrifying, Sarah said once they were alone. That was them showing their hand. Marcus corrected. They offered $5,000, which means they know they owe you at least $50,000. And they're scared enough to violate professional ethics by approaching you directly. Sarah's phone rang almost immediately. James Chin's number appeared on the screen. Sarah, I just received a very angry call from opposing counsel claiming that you're being advised by someone who threatened their attorneys. Please tell me you didn't threaten anyone. Sarah looked at Marcus, who smiled and shook his head. No threats were made, she replied truthfully. 4 lawyers approached me in the park and tried to pressure me into accepting a $5,000 settlement. My friend Marcus was present and suggested they contact you instead of harassing me directly. They offered $5,000? Chin's excitement was audible. Sarah, that's fantastic news. It means they're panicking. My original settlement demand was $75,000, and if they're offering $5,000 without negotiation, they're prepared to go much higher. Marcus was pleased to hear the confirmation of his tactical assessment. What's our next move? Our next move is to document this direct contact as additional evidence of bad faith, Chin replied. Approaching a represented party directly violates legal ethics, and attempting to coerce a settlement through intimidation could be considered extortion. So, this actually helps our case tremendously. I'm going to file a complaint with the State Bar and demand an immediate settlement conference. If they want to play hardball, they just gave us a much bigger bat. After Chun hung up, Marcus and Sarah sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. The morning had been stressful, but it had also provided clear evidence that their legal strategy was working better than expected. I keep expecting this to be too good to be true, Sarah said finally. Like I'm going to wake up and discover it was all a dream. Marcus understood her disbelief. After weeks of homelessness and hopelessness, the possibility of both vindication and substantial compensation probably seemed surreal. It's real, Marcus assured her, and you deserve it. What happened to you is wrong, and they know it. That's why they're so desperate to make it go away. What if they escalate things further? What if they try to hurt us somehow? Marcus considered her question seriously. His SEAL experience had taught him to plan for worst-case scenarios while remaining focused on achievable objectives. They're lawyers, not criminals, he said finally. Their weapons are legal briefs and intimidation tactics, not physical violence. And we've already proven that intimidation doesn't work on us. Over the following days, Chen's strategy proved highly effective. The complaint to the State Bar generated immediate attention from Henderson, Martinez, Cooper, and Associates partners, who were apparently unaware of the aggressive tactics their subordinates had employed. Chen received a formal apology and a request for immediate settlement negotiations. They want to meet this Friday, Chen informed them during a conference call. They've authorized their lead partner to negotiate directly, which suggests they want to resolve this quickly. What should we expect? Sarah asked. I expect them to offer somewhere between $25,000 and $40,000 initially, Chen replied. We'll counter at $90,000 and probably settle around $60,000 to $70,000. Marcus was impressed by Chen's confidence and strategic thinking. The attorney clearly understood the psychology of negotiation and had accurately predicted his opponent's desperation level. The settlement negotiation took place in Chen's conference room on Friday afternoon. Henderson, Martinez, Cooper, and Associates sent their managing partner, a distinguished man in his 60s named Robert Henderson, along with 2 other attorneys. The contrast between their polite professionalism and the intimidation tactics from earlier in the week was stark. We want to apologize for the inappropriate contact with Ms. Thompson, Henderson began. The attorneys involved have been disciplined, and we're prepared to offer reasonable compensation to resolve this matter. Chen smiled politely. We appreciate the apology, Mr. Henderson. What do you consider reasonable compensation? $30,000 plus a positive employment reference, Henderson replied. That's insulting, Chen responded immediately. Ms. Thompson's damages exceed $100,000 when you include lost wages, emotional distress, and punitive damages for your firm's pattern of illegal employment practices. Marcus watched the negotiation with fascination, recognizing similarities to the tactical maneuvering he'd learned in military strategy courses. Each side probed for weaknesses while trying to project strength, looking for opportunities to gain advantage through superior information or positioning. The negotiation continued for 3 hours, with offers and counteroffers gradually moving toward a middle ground. Henderson's team clearly wanted to settle quickly, while Chen methodically documented every violation of law and professional ethics that strengthened Sarah's position. Finally, Henderson made what he called his final offer. $65,000, a positive reference, and agreement that your client will not discuss the terms of this settlement. Chen looked at Sarah, who had been listening quietly throughout the proceedings. What do you think? Sarah thought about the past few months, the fear, the hunger, the cold nights on the park bench, the slow erosion of her dignity and hope. $65,000 represented not just compensation for those hardships, but security and opportunity for her future. I accept, she said simply. Henderson looked relieved. Excellent. We can have the paperwork prepared by Monday. As the opposing attorneys departed, Chen turned to Sarah with obvious satisfaction. Congratulations. You just won one of the largest employment settlements I've handled this year. Marcus felt the deep satisfaction that came from successful mission completion. Operation Second Chance had exceeded all objectives, transforming Sarah from a homeless woman into someone with both financial security and legal vindication. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now you get your life back, Marcus replied, with significant interest. As they left Chen's office that evening, Sarah was quiet for a long time. Finally, she turned to Marcus with tears in her eyes. I don't know how to thank you, she said. You saved my life. Marcus smiled, thinking about the journey they'd taken together from that first morning on the park bench to this moment of triumph. You saved your own life. I just helped you remember how strong you are. The next morning, for the first time in months, Sarah didn't meet Marcus at the park bench. She was in a hotel room, taking her first hot shower in weeks, preparing for a new chapter of her life. Marcus ran his usual route alone, but instead of feeling empty, he felt proud. Operation Second Chance was officially complete, but Marcus knew that his mission to help those who couldn't help themselves was just beginning. Sarah had reminded him of something he'd learned in the military, but forgotten in civilian life, that the most important victories were those that restored hope and dignity to people who had lost both. The four lawyers who had tried to intimidate Sarah never imagined that their aggressive tactics would unite a homeless woman and a retired Navy SEAL in a partnership that would ultimately cost their client far more than a fair settlement would have. They had underestimated both Sarah's strength and Marcus's determination, and that miscalculation had led to their complete defeat. As Marcus finished his morning run, he was already thinking about other people who might need assistance, other operations that might restore justice where injustice had prevailed. He had found his new mission, and he was ready to execute it with the same precision and dedication that had made him an effective SEAL. The park bench sat empty, but it would always represent the beginning of something important, a place where despair had been transformed into hope, where defeat had become victory, and where two unlikely allies had discovered that together they could overcome any challenge. 6 months after the settlement was finalized, Marcus Rodriguez received an unexpected phone call that would change everything he thought he knew about Sarah's case. The caller identified herself as Detective Linda Parker from the Riverside Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, and her first words sent a chill down his spine. "Mr. Rodriguez, we need to talk about Sarah Thompson and her former employer. We have reason to believe that what happened to her was part of a much larger criminal conspiracy." Marcus met Detective Parker at a coffee shop downtown, choosing a public location out of habit and caution. Parker was a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of focused intensity that Marcus recognized from his own military experience. She carried a thick file folder that she placed on the table between them. "Before we begin," Parker said, "I want you to know that neither you nor Ms. Thompson are under investigation. You're potential witnesses to what we believe is a systematic fraud scheme." Marcus felt relief, but also curiosity. What kind of fraud scheme? Parker opened her file and spread out several documents. "Over the past 18 months, we've received reports from 17 former employees of Henderson, Martinez, Cooper, and Associates. All of them were fired under questionable circumstances, and all of them accepted small settlements rather than pursue legal action." Marcus studied the papers, recognizing a pattern that his military intelligence training helped him identify quickly. They're systematically firing employees to avoid paying benefits and building legal cases against companies who do the same thing. Exactly. It's a sophisticated operation. They fire employees illegally, intimidate them into accepting minimal settlements, then use their expertise in employment law to defend other companies accused of identical practices. Parker pointed to a spreadsheet showing settlement amounts. Most victims accepted between $2,000 and $8,000. Ms. Thompson was unusual in two ways. She fought back, and she had help. Marcus understood the implications immediately. So the $65,000 Sarah received was probably a fraction of what they've stolen from other employees. "We estimate the total fraud at over $2 million, Parker confirmed. "But here's where it gets more interesting. We've discovered that Henderson, Martinez, Cooper, and Associates has been sharing information about their illegal practices with client companies, essentially teaching them how to fire employees without consequences." Marcus felt the familiar anger that came with discovering injustice on a large scale. They're running a criminal enterprise. That's our assessment. But building a case requires evidence, and most of their victims are too scared or too poor to cooperate with our investigation. Parker leaned forward. "We need Ms. Thompson's help, and we need yours. What exactly are you asking us to do?" Parker explained that the FBI had joined the investigation after discovering that Henderson, Martinez, Cooper, and Associates was operating across state lines, sharing their illegal strategies with law firms in Nevada, Arizona, and Oregon. They needed witnesses willing to testify about the firm's practices, and Sarah's case was one of the strongest they'd found. The problem is that most victims signed non-disclosure agreements as part of their settlements. Parker continued. They can't talk about what happened without risking legal retaliation. Marcus immediately saw the strategic challenge. But Sarah's settlement included a non-disclosure clause too. True, but there's an exception for cooperation with law enforcement investigations. We could provide her with immunity from civil liability if she agrees to testify. Marcus considered the implications carefully. Sarah had worked hard to rebuild her life after the settlement. She now had an apartment, a good job with a nonprofit organization, and was slowly recovering from the trauma of homelessness. Asking her to relive those experiences in court testimony would be difficult. I'll need to discuss this with Sarah, Marcus said, and with her attorney. Of course. But, Mr. Rodriguez, I want you to understand the bigger picture here. This law firm has destroyed dozens of lives over the past few years. People like Ms. Thompson who lost their jobs, their homes, their hope. If we can't build a case against them, they'll continue operating with impunity. Marcus understood the appeal to his sense of justice, and he felt the same commitment to protecting others that had motivated his military service. But he also felt protective of Sarah and reluctant to ask her to sacrifice her newly regained peace of mind for the greater good. How much danger would she face if she agreed to cooperate? Marcus asked. Parker's expression grew serious. That's actually one of our biggest concerns. This law firm has shown they're willing to use intimidation tactics, and they have connections throughout the legal community. Witnesses in cases like this sometimes face professional retaliation, harassment, and even threats. Marcus felt his protective instincts engage fully. What kind of protection could you provide? Limited. We can monitor her communications, provide emergency response if she's threatened, and prosecute anyone who retaliates against her. But we can't provide 24-hour security or relocate her unless the threat level escalates dramatically. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, processing the information and considering options. His SEAL training had taught him to assess risks and benefits systematically, but this situation involved someone he cared about, which complicated the analysis. There's something else you should know, Parker added. We have reason to believe that Henderson, Martinez, Cooper and Associates is planning to expand their operation significantly. They're franchising their illegal strategies to law firms across the country. If we don't stop them now, we could be looking at a nationwide conspiracy affecting thousands of employees. The scope of the threat changed Marcus's calculation considerably. This wasn't just about seeking justice for past victims. It was about preventing future ones. I'll talk to Sarah, Marcus said finally. But the decision has to be hers. Marcus called Sarah that evening and arranged to meet her for dinner at a quiet restaurant near her apartment. She looked healthy and confident, a dramatic contrast to the frightened woman he'd first encountered on the park bench. Her success in rebuilding her life made the prospect of asking her to risk it again particularly difficult. I have something serious to discuss with you, Marcus said after they'd ordered dinner. It's about your old case. Sarah's expression immediately became guarded. I thought that was finished. Marcus explained Detective Parker's visit and the investigation into Henderson, Martinez, Cooper, and Associates. As he talked, he watched Sarah's face cycle through surprise, anger, and fear. They did this to other people? Sarah asked. The same thing they did to me? 17 others that the police know about, probably more who haven't come forward. Sarah was quiet for a long time, stirring her coffee absently. What exactly would they want me to do? Marcus explained the testimony requirements, the legal protections, and the potential risks. He was careful to present the information objectively, without trying to influence her decision in either direction. If I don't cooperate, they'll probably get away with it? Sarah asked. Possibly. The police have other evidence, but witness testimony is crucial in white-collar crime cases. Sarah nodded slowly. And if I do cooperate, I could face retaliation. Yes, though the police would do everything they can to protect you. Marcus could see Sarah weighing the decision carefully, and he respected her need to consider all the implications. The woman sitting across from him was no longer the desperate, defeated person he'd first helped. She was strong, thoughtful, and capable of making difficult decisions. "Marcus," Sarah said finally, "when you were in the military, did you ever have to choose between your personal safety and doing what was right?" The question surprised him, but he understood why she was asking. "Many times," he replied honestly. "How did you decide?" Marcus thought about the various missions he'd undertaken, the risks he'd accepted, the sacrifices he'd made. "I asked myself what kind of person I wanted to be and what kind of world I wanted to live in." The answer usually made the choice clear. Sarah smiled. "I think I know my answer." The next morning, Sarah called Detective Parker and agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. She also called James Shun to discuss the legal implications of breaking her non-disclosure agreement, and he confirmed that the law enforcement exception would protect her from civil liability. Over the following weeks, Sarah spent dozens of hours with federal investigators, providing detailed testimony about her experience with Henderson, Martinez, Cooper, and Associates. The process was emotionally exhausting, forcing her to relive the trauma of her illegal termination and subsequent homelessness, but she approached it with the same determination she'd shown in rebuilding her life. Marcus accompanied her to most of the interviews, providing moral support and occasionally adding details from his own observations of the firm's intimidation tactics. The investigators were particularly interested in his account of the 4 lawyers who had approached Sarah in the park, since it demonstrated the firm's willingness to violate professional ethics. "Your testimony is incredibly valuable," FBI agent Jennifer Walsh told them after one particularly long session. "The combination of documented illegal employment practices and witness intimidation gives us a strong foundation for both civil and criminal charges." As the investigation progressed, more victims began coming forward. News of the federal inquiry had spread through employment law networks, and former employees who had been too afraid to speak up previously found the courage to contact authorities. Each new witness strengthened the case and revealed additional aspects of the conspiracy. Marcus found himself serving as an unofficial coordinator for the victim witnesses, using his military organizational skills to help keep track of timelines, evidence, and testimony. Many of the victims were still struggling financially and emotionally from their experiences, and Marcus worked to connect them with legal aid resources and support services. "You've become quite the victim advocate," Detective Parker observed during one of their regular briefings. Marcus smiled. "I found my new mission." 3 months into the investigation, Henderson, Martinez, Cooper, and Associates received notification that they were under federal criminal investigation. Their response was swift and predictable. They began a campaign of intimidation against potential witnesses that was more sophisticated and aggressive than anything they'd attempted previously. Sarah started receiving phone calls at all hours from unknown numbers. Her car was vandalized twice in her apartment parking lot. She found threatening letters slipped under her apartment door, warning her about the consequences of making false statements to authorities. Marcus responded to the escalating intimidation by implementing security measures based on his military training. He helped Sarah vary her daily routines, taught her basic situational awareness techniques, and established regular check-in protocols. He also began spending more time at her apartment building, ostensibly visiting, but actually conducting informal security patrols. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted during one particularly difficult week when the harassment had intensified. "Maybe I shouldn't have agreed to cooperate." Marcus understood her fear, but he also knew that backing down now would not only hurt the investigation, but also leave her vulnerable to continued intimidation. "They're scared too," he pointed out. "Scared people make mistakes, and they've already made several." Indeed, Henderson, Martinez, Cooper, and Associates' intimidation campaign was being documented by federal investigators and would ultimately become additional criminal charges against the firm's partners. Every threatening letter, every harassing phone call, every act of retaliation strengthened the prosecution's case. The breakthrough came when one of the firm's junior associates, horrified by the criminal investigation and the intimidation tactics, agreed to cooperate with authorities. Maria Santos had been with the firm for only 6 months, but she had access to internal communications that documented the systematic nature of the illegal employment practices. "They have a manual," Agent Walsh told Marcus and Sarah during an emergency meeting. "A literal instruction guide for firing employees illegally and intimidating them into accepting minimal settlements. Ms. Santos provided us with copies. The manual was a prosecutor's dream, detailed written evidence of criminal conspiracy that would be nearly impossible for the defendants to explain or deny. It included scripts for intimidating conversations with fired employees, legal strategies for avoiding legitimate employment law claims, and even recommendations for private investigators who could conduct harassment campaigns against uncooperative witnesses." With the documentary evidence provided by Maria Santos, the federal case against Henderson, Martinez, Cooper and Associates became overwhelming. The firm's partners were arrested on charges including conspiracy, wire fraud, mail fraud, and witness intimidation. Several client companies who had implemented the firm's illegal strategies were also charged. Sarah's role in the prosecution shifted from primary witness to supporting testimony as the documentary evidence became the centerpiece of the government's case. She still testified at trial, but the pressure was reduced significantly by the overwhelming nature of the evidence against the defendants. The trial lasted 6 weeks and received extensive media coverage as a landmark case in employment law enforcement. Marcus attended every day of proceedings, partly to support Sarah, but also because he found the legal process fascinating from a strategic perspective. Sarah's testimony was powerful and compelling. She spoke clearly and confidently about her illegal termination, her descent into homelessness, and the impact of the firm's actions on her life. When the defense attorneys attempted to discredit her as a disgruntled former employee seeking money, she calmly responded that she had already received compensation through civil litigation and was testifying solely to prevent other people from suffering similar injustices. Marcus was called to testify about the intimidation tactics he'd witnessed, and his military background lent credibility to his detailed observations about the firm's behavior. The jury was visibly disturbed by his account of 4 lawyers approaching a homeless woman in a park to pressure her into accepting an inadequate settlement. The verdicts were unanimous across all counts. The 3 partners of Henderson, Martinez, Cooper and Associates were convicted of conspiracy, fraud, and witness intimidation. They received sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years in federal prison, along with orders to pay restitution to all identified victims. More importantly, from Marcus's perspective, the case resulted in systematic changes to employment law enforcement. The Department of Justice established a new task force to investigate similar conspiracies, and several states passed legislation strengthening protections for workers who report illegal employment practices. At the sentencing hearing, Sarah was given the opportunity to address the court about the impact of the defendant's crimes. Her statement was brief but powerful. "These men didn't just fire me illegally," she said. "They tried to destroy my belief in justice, in fairness, in the possibility that good people would help when someone was in trouble. They failed because I met someone who reminded me that there are still people willing to fight for what's right, even when it's difficult." As they left the courthouse after sentencing, Marcus and Sarah walked together through the media crowd that had gathered to cover the conclusion of the high-profile case. Sarah had been transformed once again, not back into the desperate woman Marcus had first met, but into someone stronger than she'd ever been before. "What's next for you?" Marcus asked as they reached his truck. "I've been offered a job with the Department of Labor," Sarah replied, "investigating employment law violations. Apparently, my experience makes me particularly qualified." Marcus smiled. "That's perfect. What about you? Are you going to keep helping people who need it?" Marcus looked back at the courthouse where justice had finally been served, thinking about the long journey from that first morning on the park bench to this moment of complete victory. "I think I found my calling," he said. "Operation Second Chance is now a permanent mission." 6 months later, Marcus had established a formal nonprofit organization dedicated to helping homeless individuals navigate legal and social service systems. Sarah served on his board of directors, contributing insights from both her experience as a victim and her new role as a federal investigator. The organization operated out of a small office near the park where Marcus and Sarah had first met, and it had already helped over 50 people rebuild their lives. Marcus applied the same systematic, mission-focused approach that had made him an effective SEAL, while Sarah brought expertise in legal rights and bureaucratic navigation. Their morning coffee meetings had evolved into operational briefings for their expanding work, but they still met at the same park bench that had been the beginning of their unlikely partnership. The bench now had a small plaque identifying it as the founding location of Second Chance Operations, though most people walking by had no idea of the remarkable story it represented. Marcus often reflected on how a simple decision to help one person had led to exposing a criminal conspiracy, transforming federal employment law enforcement, and creating an organization that would help thousands of people over the coming years. It reminded him of a principle from military strategy, that small actions, executed with precision and persistence, could have consequences far beyond their immediate scope. The four lawyers who had tried to intimidate Sarah on that park bench had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately destroyed their criminal enterprise and sent them to federal prison. They had underestimated both Sarah's courage and Marcus's determination, and that miscalculation had cost them everything. More importantly, their failure had created something positive and lasting. Sarah had not only regained her life, but had found a way to prevent other people from experiencing similar injustices. Marcus had discovered that his military skills could be applied to civilian missions that were just as important as anything he'd accomplished in uniform. As Marcus finished his morning run on the anniversary of meeting Sarah, he paused at the memorial bench and reflected on the year that had changed both their lives. Tomorrow, he would begin helping another person who needed assistance, a veteran struggling with disability benefits, recommended by a social worker who had heard about their organization. Operation Second Chance.